Olá, eu sou a Cibele e hoje eu e o João Pentagna estamos aqui com uma celebridade na Inglaterra, o Joseph Devlin. Ele é neurocientista, ele vai contar um pouquinho da história dele aí quando ele se apresentar. E a gente, como sempre, vai gravar esse episódio em inglês e depois, ao final, vocês podem procurar ali na descrição do episódio que a gente vai colocar o tempo certinho que eu e o João vamos fazer uma resenha em português para você que não tem influência no idioma. Tá bom? Vamos começar? Hi, Joseph. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for accepting our invitation. I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself and then tell us why should companies be interested in consumer neuroscience?
Well, thank you, Cibele, and thank you, Jean. My name is Joe Devlin, and I'm a professor of computer science. Goodness gracious, consumer neuroscience at University College London. I actually did my first degree in computer science, and somehow that just came out. The reason I think companies should be interested in consumer neuroscience is because it allows them to get past some of the limitations of traditional market research. So everybody who works in market research or advertising and PR, they understand that a lot of the traditional methods are based on self-report. You do focus groups, you ask people questions, you do interviews or surveys, and it's absolutely fine. But there are some important limitations there. And some of that is just that people don't always know how to answer those questions. And it's not that they're not trying to. They'd love to be able to give you an answer. But if they don't know the answer, they have a tendency to make things up. So there's a limit to how much information you can get just by asking people to sort of reflect on their own experience. If you can turn to the tools of neuroscience, you have another way of getting extra information. So obviously, all the decisions that we make happen inside our brains, inside our nervous system. And if we can use the tools to try to get extra information about how you made those decisions, what were the factors that influenced you in making a purchase decision or becoming, more loyal to a brand or whatever the case may be, then I think you can get additional information that you can layer on top of traditional market research. So I think that consumer neuroscience provides additional insights that can be useful to companies.
And Joseph, can you share some real-world examples or case studies where business successfully used consumer neuroscience to boost their performance?
Sure. There are two that I like very much. One was Virgin Australia. So it's, the Virgin airline in Australia did this very cool new policy where, the reality is nobody wants to sit in the middle seat, right? Particularly in a country as big as Brazil or as big as Australia, those are long flights and uncomfortable seats. So they decided to do this new change, which was that if you were sitting in a middle seat, either because that's what you bought or because you bought a ticket and that's where you ended up, they put your name into this lottery, which meant that you could win prizes. And they could be rewards in terms of air miles, they could be free trips, they could be a bunch of different things, new holidays. This is a really great use of consumer neuroscience because what they did was they leveraged our understanding of how dopamine works in the brain. Dopamine is this reward drug, and it's anytime you're in a situation where you're in a rewarding situation, dopamine is released and it encourages you to repeat the behavior. But it's particularly strong if it's not a certain reward. So that is to say there's some uncertainty, there's a gamble here. And Virgin Australia are taking advantage of that. So just by simply being stuck in, 3B, you get entered into this lottery and you potentially win these rewards. And the customers loved it, right? So people won extra flights, etc. Not every time, but you knew that there was always an opportunity. And it really made people much more willing to sit in these seats, even for reasonably long flights. And it increased brand loyalty in Virgin Australia rather considerably. Even if you weren't a loyalty member card, you were still more likely afterwards to fly Virgin Australia than other airlines that were offering the same flights. And it was so successful that the company, which rolled it out for 6 months to begin with, has now made it an indefinite product. And all they did was use this very simple kind of information about how our brains process reward in order to improve their sort of loyalty of their customers and make the experience more pleasant, more rewarding for their customers. I think that's a great, simple example of leveraging this sort of neuroscience insight. Another real quick one was one that we did with Audible, the people who do auditory books. Audible came to me quite a few years ago at this point and asked a really interesting question, which was, if you consume a story as an audiobook versus like as a video, does that change the way you actually engage with the story? Same story, but the format changes, right? And I thought that was fascinating because despite having worked in neuroscience for 20 years in language, I didn't know the answer. So we did a study with them where we had people listening to series of different scenes, emotional scenes from different stories. So there was like Game of Thrones, there was Girl on a Train, there was some old literature, a bunch of different ones. And what was fascinating was we could measure people's emotional response using kind of biometric tools that measure heart rate and galvanic skin response. And we also asked people about their experience, like whether they liked the story better when they saw it in one form or the other. And there was a real disconnect, right? So when you ask people, they very consistently preferred the video to the audio. But when you measured their physiological response, they had a higher heart rate, they had a stronger galvanic skin response, they even had a slightly higher body temperature, all of which indicated that they were engaging with the stories more deeply, more carefully when they were doing it as an auditory book than as a video. And this is a perfect example of the disconnect, right? It makes it why it's hard to ask people and just assume that you got all the information. The reality is that they're engaging more deeply when they're hearing it as an audiobook because they're kind of co-creators, right? They are imagining the scenes, the people, the dialogue, etc. And that makes them work harder. And actually that leads them to liking the story more and to remembering the content better. And for me, what was really fascinating was Audible took this and changed the way they talk to authors. So auditory books is very successful. And if you write a book, Audible will approach you and say, hey, have you thought about doing an audiobook? Because otherwise you're going to miss out on a big part of the market. After this study, they added something to that. And they said, look, we did this study with UCL, and it shows that if you want to really engage with your audience, an audiobook might be the best format for doing that, because we found that the audiences were more deeply engaged. And for most authors, that's what they really care about. Like, most people aren't professional authors. They're not earning their money off of yet another book. It's a passion project, and they really care, and they want their audience to care. So this is a really fun way that Audible has used this information to change the way they speak with authors and encourage more people to do audiobooks.
Do you think this same works for podcasts?
Yeah.
Like the one we are recording now?
Yeah, it's really an interesting point, because I think one of the neat things about podcasts is that it's more of a dialogue. So unlike a radio show or something where basically someone's talking at you, in a discussion, people actually automatically kind of lean into discussion. So the more we interact, the more people actually feel like they're part of the discussion, and that's rewarding for people. So I think that one of the real advantages of pods, and one of the reasons that pods have been so successful, like yours, is exactly that kind of dialogue.
Amazing. We are in the right way to do business.
You most certainly are.
So Joseph, the stories you mentioned, for many people, these types of projects are really sounds really expensive. You know that, especially here in Brazil, that people are not used to consumer neuroscience. But is this kind of projects regarding consumer neuroscience, neuromarketing, neuroscience applied to business, whatever you want to say, are only available for big companies, or small companies are able to do that?
Well, I think that there's potential for both big and small companies. For me, I make a distinction between neuroscience that's used to provide new insights and neuroscience that's used to provide marketing materials. So the new insights, things like the Audible experiment, are reasonably expensive and time-consuming. And you're right, I think that they're more available to these larger companies. But sometimes what you can do is leverage what's called the seductive allure of neuroscience, right? The idea that just including the brain makes people kind of lean in more, makes them more interested, makes them attend more. And there's some really interesting psychology behind that, but it's an easy thing to use. So for instance, there's a company here in the UK called Focus Bikes, and they make mountain bikes. And they approached me and said, we're interested in this idea of the rider's high. So when you're mountain biking, there's a rush to it. It's really exciting. And they said, what's going on in the brain? And the truth of the matter is, this isn't new neuroscience. I can tell you what's going on in the brain. So they did this video where they brought in one of their influencer mountain biker guys, right? Ollie Wilkins. And we put Ollie in our MRI scanner. And we did a little experiment where we could measure what was happening in Ollie's brain while he was watching different videos of his own mountain biking and other people's mountain biking. And then I did a little piece to camera where I could then say, look, there are at least 3 different things that are going on with rider's high. Some of it's reward processing when you hit those difficult bits. You're going fast down a slope, you're hitting jumps, you're going over boulders. They do crazy things on these bikes. That being successful with that increases the reward chemical dopamine in your brain. And that's one thing. Another thing is, just simply because you're exercising, you get this increase of cortisol in your brain that leads to changes in stress levels. So you get in this kind of flow state. And this is what's probably really exciting. For most of us, we're so distracted by cell phones and social media and all of the things that, that intrude on your existence. You can't do that. When you're going down a mountainside, you need to focus, right? Otherwise, you're going to go into a tree. And that's unusual, but in itself, that's rewarding. People enjoy that experience, the excitement associated with it. And then finally, you get this actual kind of high that comes from, people used to think it was endorphins, but it turns out it's more endocannabinoids. So you have these chemicals in your brain that are exactly the same that you would get if you were to smoke marijuana, right? The cannabinoids are the chemical process in marijuana that gives you that high. And it's one of the things that you feel after exercise, whether it's mountain biking or running or swimming. And it gives you this feeling of peace, and also you just feel good, right? And we could show those things play out in Ollie's brain, and they made a very cool video about it. Honestly, the whole thing took 2 days, and it wasn't very expensive. They brought in the film crew to do it. And that kind of video then went a little viral, and people loved it, right? It was a beautiful example of marketing that involved the seductive allure. But it isn't expensive. It's demonstrating things we already know, and it's doing it in a valid way that just makes it accessible to people. And I think those kind of examples are really available to anybody, small, medium enterprise, all the way up to big, giant corporate.
But Joseph, isn't that seductive allure the nonsense that leads to neurowater and companies that just add notional neuroscience to flog their products?
Yeah, it absolutely is, right? So some people choose to flog their stuff using this seductive allure and what I would call neurobolics. It's just nonsense. Neurowater is a brilliant example. Here, it's literally a product that costs £7 a bottle, and it's a bottle of water that they've put the word neuro in front of. Personally, I find that a bit offensive because there's nothing neuroscience to it. They're just trying to take advantage of this kind of celebrity endorsement from the brain. And I think it's not the most ethical way to do things. I think that to use the seductive allure properly, what you should be doing is basing it on valid science. But while you do that, you can maybe just be demonstrating valid science in novel ways. You don't have to be creating new insights as a result of it. It's expensive and time consuming. And look, companies that do it wrong sometimes pay the price for that, right? So just as a couple of examples, I mean, Apple, when they released their iPhone, if you remember, they went nuts, right? Everybody loved their iPhones. But there was this study that they did using MRI where they said that people don't, they're not addicted to their iPhones. They love their iPhones based on these brain scans that they had done. And Apple had started a big ad campaign based on that until a community of neuroscientists came out and said, look, this is just nonsense. I mean, you made this stuff up. It's an incorrect interpretation of what you're doing. And Apple kind of quietly shelved a 7-figure ad campaign that's a real cost for getting the science wrong. And Porsche did a funny little ad where they compared driving a Porsche to flying a fighter jet, where they just simply made up the data. Like, it's entirely fake. And once again, what happened was it got called out and got very negative media attention. And for a company that prides themselves on their engineering and their science, it's not a good position to be faking your science, right? So the brand reputation harm here is really bad. And finally, there was one in the US, there was one of these brain training companies called Lumosity. And they made these claims that doing their brain training helped stave off things like Alzheimer's disease. It would keep your brain healthy as you aged. And it turns out they didn't really have any evidence for that whatsoever. And they got basically taken to court by the Federal Trade Commission in the US and had to pay a $2 million fine and remove all of their advertising across all of their channels. So, I think that getting the science right is important, and putting out neuro water or neuro nonsense of this or that is a very bad way to use the neuroscience. Well, there are cheap, effective, good ways to do it instead.
And what about ethics? What are the key ethical considerations business should keep in mind when they apply neuroscience insights to marketing and consumer engagement strategies?
Yeah, I love the ethics side of this because I think that it's something that's underreported. So thanks for asking about it. For me, I think that there are about 6 principles that really matter. And as long as companies are consistent with these principles, they're in good shape. So the first is really, they need to be transparent. If you're using neuroscience, then you should be telling people that you're using neuroscience so that they can make an informed, voluntary decision. And that I think is the important second property. People who are engaging with it have to be doing it based on that knowledge, right? They can't be tricked or manipulated into having their neuroscience used against them. And I can give you an example of that if you want. So eye tracking technology has improved dramatically in recent years, mostly due to gaming, surprisingly. But it's now possible to do eye tracking pretty well just using your cell phone or your laptop, the little camera on it. And what you can do if you were an e-commerce site is you can track where people's eyes are on their screen, consumers. And for instance, if they're looking at a product or if they maybe return to looking at a product, you can use that information to sort of pop up a little, hey, if you buy this now, you get 10% off. To me, that's straight out manipulative. If you've used data without telling people that you've collected that data, that is not an ethical use of this kind of neurodata. The other things, and the reason is because it limits people's autonomy. You're not giving them the full agency so that they can make their own voluntary decisions, right? And then the last 2 little parts, and maybe this matters more to me than other people, is I think it has to be valid neuroscience. Like, I think that if you're using fake or bull neuroscience, then you're not doing anyone a favor. That's how you get in that sort of Apple situation or the Porsche situation, where just by trying to fake the data or misunderstanding the data, you're going off in the wrong directions. You're misleading consumers, whether you intended to or not. But it runs the risk of also being unfair. Like, if you're collecting data that's not valid and then using it to make decisions, then you have the possibility of discriminating against populations without even knowing that you're doing it. And that is really risky. Like, that's kind of the unseen ethical risk to most consumer neuroscience. If it's based on a small sample and you didn't test it with a larger sample, you get bad results. And again, just coming back to Apple, because they did this thing a few years ago where they offered a credit card. It turns out they were using some neuroscience and some AI to try to decide your credit limit. And it systematically gave men a much higher credit limit than women, even if the woman was the main earner in the family. And it was just because they hadn't really tested the data sufficiently well, that they were discriminating against people, And that's the kind of thing that is a real risk with neurodata. Unless you know that it's being applied fairly, then the potential for discrimination is pretty high. And countries like Chile just passed a law about ethical use of neurotech. It's the only country in the world that's ever done it. And I think they deserve a ton of credit for leading the thinking in this area. I mean, you can quibble about the nature of the law, but the fact that they've been thinking about it and think that it's important enough to enshrine in their constitution, I think will lead the rest of the world in the right direction. And I applaud them for that decision.
And Joseph, besides Chile, do you know any other country that has laws regarding the use to neuroscience to business?
Well, the answer is no. I haven't seen any other country that specifically has that kind of law in place. Oddly, the state of Illinois within the United States has a similar law about how biometric data can be used effectively and appropriately and legally that shares a lot of the properties of the Chilean country law, but it's one of 50 states and no other part of the US has it. There are legal frameworks that are in place. So, for instance, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation is a framework that is relevant to some of the neurotech, but there's a whole lot of neurotechnology that's not under that law. So I think that there are frameworks that are relevant, but there's nothing as complete as the Chilean approach. And hopefully other countries will follow suit and will think, yeah, this is important and we need to put regulation in place to safeguard consumers.
And Joseph, you mentioned neuroblocks, neuromyths, some kind of a specific word about neuromyths. What's the most common neuromyths that you saw in the internet in general?
Yeah, it's hard. There's so many. One of the most common ones is the whole idea of being left brain or right brain.
Yeah.
And the idea is left brain people are logical, good at language, good at math, maybe science and technology. And right brain people are more emotional, more creative, more artistic, more musical. And obviously some people are more musical and some people are more logical, but it has nothing to do with left or right brains. Years ago, when I went to visit my daughter's parents' night at her school, so she was only in secondary school, there was a poster on the wall of the school that had left and right brain, right? And it said, oh, we train you in math and science and such, and we also train you in art and music, and this is how we train your whole brain. And my poor daughter looked at me looking at this poster, and she just walked up and said, you will not speak to the headmistress about this. So it's a really common myth. It comes up all the time. And lots of people confuse the idea that, yes, I may be more artistic or I may be more logical with the idea that somehow this is because only one side of my brain is dominant and the other side is sitting there like a lump, I guess. And that's a crazy myth. It's an old one, but it's very common.